Hello and welcome to Haunted Montreal's Spooky Story Sessions. I'm your host, Holly Rhiannon, and today I'm going to tell you all about Le Chasse-Galerie. Here at Haunted Montreal, we bring you ghost stories in both French and English every Saturday. Before we get into today's episode, please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell button so you get notified every time we have a new tale to share. And if you're already subscribed, thank you so much. We're happy to have you and welcome back. There is one other thing to note today. This is our last episode of 2022. Dr. Mab and I will be taking a holiday for the month of December and very much look forward to seeing you all in the new year. Thank you, all of you, so much for your amazing support during our first year on YouTube. Now, without further ado, let's get spooky. With the impending new year, the fantastic legend of Le Chasse-Galerie will soon be fresh in the minds of many Montrealers, if only for the fact that it is the most famous Quebecois story set on New Year's Eve. According to local lore, those who hear a noise in the sky on New Year's Eve should look up because they just might spot a canoe flying through the air full of terrified lumberjacks on their unholy journey to hell. Legends from the era of New France often involved a deal with the devil. Indeed, the colonization of present-day Quebec was initially carried out by Jesuit missionaries who practiced a very austere form of Catholicism. Seeing the devil everywhere in the dark forests of the New World, the Jesuits constantly warned the French colonists not to be tempted into sin, lest they compromise their souls. One zealous Jesuit priest named Paul Le Jeune actually went as far as describing New France as the Empire of Satan, prompting fertile imaginations to concoct fantastic magical legends. With such prominent religious discourse, the devil features prominently in the French colony's earliest folklore. The tale of Le Chasse-Galerie is thought to be an intercultural story combining European folklore and a First Nations legend about a flying canoe. Many folklorists believe the story is partly based on a medieval legend called the Wild Hunt, about a wicked man named Lord Gallery. The Lord hailed from Poitou, France, a settlement where many of the colonists were born. Instead of going to church on Sundays, Lord Gallery preferred to go hunting, le chasse in French, something considered sacrilegious at the time. As punishment, Lord Gallery was sentenced to hunt at night for eternity, all the while being chased by galloping horses and howling wolves. Thus, the title, Le Chasse-Galerie, means gallery's hunt, which signifies the work of the devil. The essential moral of the story is that those who obey the teachings of the Catholic Church will never be led astray by sin. As French colonization began in the early 1600s, it soon became apparent that there were a lot of riches to be made in fur trading. In the 1640s, a class of independent traders began to develop known as the coureurs de bois, or runners of the woods. These adventurous merchants adopted customs of the First Nations and learned their languages as their canoes penetrated deep into the continent's interior in search of commerce. Needless to say, it is likely the story of Le Chasse-Galerie evolved during their lengthy voyages through the wilderness. With the settlement of Ville-Marie on Montreal Island becoming the center of the fur trade in the late 1600s, it wasn't long before the astounding legend was being told in the colony. The strange idea of flying canoes certainly gripped the imaginations of the French colonists. In 1661, following a series of earthquakes that shook New France, Paul Le Jeune reported human screams coming from the sky and fiery canoes hurtling through the air above the colony. He wrote, "The canoes, which appeared all on fire, fluttered through air all around Quebec, were only a light but true omen of the enemy canoes that prowled our coasts this summer." Describing the situation as a disastrous prognostic, he theorized that the aerial screams might have been caused by French prisoners of war taken during the military conflicts between the colonists and the First Nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, what the French called the Iroquois. The brutal war was a result of the French attempting to colonize unceded First Nations territories and concluded in 1701 with a treaty called the Great Peace of Montreal. Flying canoes appear in other legends as well. In one Montreal tale retold and published by folklorist S.E. Schossler, the devil himself rides a flying canoe with 20 werewolves. In the story entitled The Devil and the Loup-Garou, a lazy farmer named Jean Dubois makes a deal with the devil so he doesn't have to do any work on his farm. Instead, the devil orders the werewolves to do it for him. When the local priest finds out and sprinkles holy water on the property, the devil becomes enraged and whisks Jean Dubois to hell in the flying canoe. However, despite the flying canoe appearing in other stories, it was the legend of La Chasse-Galerie that went on to become one of the most popular in New France. Indeed, even following the British conquest of 1760, La Chasse-Galerie would still remain a staple folktale among the population. A new class of fur traders called the voyageurs formed, and they kept the story alive on their long voyages to the far reaches of the wilderness. The most popular version of La Chasse-Galerie was written by one-time Montreal mayor Honoré Beaugrand, a bilingual politician, journalist, author, and folklorist. Elected in 1885, he governed the city through a devastating smallpox crisis. After serving for 2 years, he was defeated in the following election by a man named John Abbott. Not to be discouraged, Honoré Beaugrand returned to focus on his writing. In 1892, he published La Chasse-Galerie in English, with several French words thrown in for good measure, in Century magazine. According to the magazine, the writer has met many an old voyageur who affirmed most positively that he had seen bark canoes traveling in midair, full of men paddling and singing away under the protection of Beelzebub on their way from the timber camps of the Ottawa to pay a flying visit to their sweethearts at home. With the story still fresh on Beaugrand's mind, in 1900 he published Légendes Canadiennes in French, a series of legends which included La Chasse-Galerie, with illustrations by Henri Julien. In Beaugrand's version, Montreal is at the geographic center of the story and plays a major role in the build-up to the climax. Beaugrand's version begins at the Ross lumber camp in the Gatineau region, where a group of miserable lumberjacks are spending New Year's Eve 1858 in a distant forest. Joe, the cook, narrates a story from his youth to his fellow shantymen. He explains that about 35 years before, the camp's second boss, Baptiste Durand, made a deal with the devil in order to be able to visit his sweetheart in the faraway village of La Valtrie, via a flying canoe, no less. Joe explains that Baptiste, who had not been to church in 7 years, was the architect of the unholy plan. "We can go to La Valtrie and back in 6 hours. Don't you know that with La Chasse-Galerie we can travel 150 miles an hour when one can handle the paddles as well as we do? All there is to it is that we must not pronounce le nom de bon Dieu, the name of God, during the voyage, and that we must be careful not to touch the crosses on steeples when we travel." He surmises that they will be safe so long as they look where they're going, think about what they say before opening their mouths, and avoid drinking any alcohol. Despite some apprehension, 7 of the lumberjacks, including Joe, decide to join Baptiste on the voyage. In order to overcome the 300-mile distance, the devil provides a large flying canoe. While Beaugrand's version offers little in the way of description of the canoe, other folklorists do. In S.E. Schlosser's The Flying Canoe, Spooky Canada, pages 96 to 103, the canoe was decorated from top to bottom with archaic symbols in a red dye that looked as if it might be human blood. Furthermore, on dark nights, the symbols glowed, casting evil red shadows among the trees. And strangest of all, the canoe seemed to whisper to itself in a strange tongue that sounded like the hiss of snakes. In any case, the men climb aboard the strange vessel and pronounce the following magic words: "Acabras, acabras, acabrum, fais-nous voyager par-dessus les montagnes." Suddenly, the canoe shoots up into the air to a height of 500 or 600 feet and begins flying over the wintry forest until they reach the Ottawa River. En route to Montreal, the canoe whips past the church steeples dotting the villages along the river, which Beaugrand compares to the bayonets of marching soldiers on Montreal's military parade ground. "We began passing the tin-covered steeples as quickly as telegraph poles fly past in a railway train, and the spires shone in the air like the bayonets of the soldiers drilling on the Champ de Mars in Montreal. Flying over forests, rivers, towns, and villages, the woodsmen leave a trail of sparks in their wake. Soon they can see the dim lights of Montreal. As the canoe approaches the city, the men begin to spot numerous steeples. Montreal had a reputation for its church towers and actually was known as the City of Spires, and La Ville aux 100 Clochers, the City of 100 Bell Towers. In fact, by the time famous American author and wit Mark Twain visited Montreal in 1881, he quipped, "This is the first time I was ever in a city where you couldn't throw a brick without breaking a church window," during a speech at the Tony Windsor Hotel on December 10th. But returning to the story of Chasse-Galerie, as the canoe approaches Montreal, Baptiste decides that it would be amusing to try and terrify the people still partying on the streets below in the wee hours of the morning. He says to Joe, "Look out there, we'll just skim over Montreal and frighten some of the fellows who may be out at this hour of night. Joe, clear your whistle and get ready to sing your best canoe song, Canoe de Course, my boy." With the stroke of a paddle, Baptiste brings the canoe down on a level with the summit of the towers of Notre Dame, and the men start singing Canoe de Course, an old song from the days of New France about a flying canoe. Quebec folk music band Les Cailloux actually does a rousing version, which I will link up here. As they swoop down on the city, Joe notes, although it was well on towards 2 o'clock in the morning, we saw some groups of men who stopped in the middle of the street to watch us go by, but we went so fast that in a twinkle we had passed Montreal and its suburbs. They continue their voyage, whipping past the steeples of Long Point, Pointe-à-Tremble, Repentigny, and Saint-Sulpice until they finally arrive at their destination of La Valtrie. The men soon learn that dance, a New Year's hop, is in full swing at the home of an elderly gentleman named Baptiste Auguet. Before joining in the festivities, Baptiste warns the men one last time not to drink any rum or whiskey and to be ready to depart on his signal. The woodsmen join their loved ones and dance and party through the night. When the time comes to depart, the men reassemble outside. Unfortunately, it appears as though Baptiste himself is drunk, having consumed all sorts of alcohol at the party, contrary to their original plan. The other lumberjacks are rightfully worried, but climb aboard the canoe regardless. Before taking off, Joe exclaims, "Look out, Baptiste, old fellow. Steer straight for the mountain of Montreal as soon as you can get a glimpse of it." "I know my business," answers Baptiste sharply, "and you had better mind yours." After pronouncing the magic words, the canoe shoots off into the sky. Once airborne, it becomes apparent that Baptiste is having trouble steering the canoe in his drunken stupor. Like lightning, they fly past the steeple of Contrecoeur, almost hitting it. Instead of heading west towards Montreal, Baptiste mistakenly steers towards the Richelieu River. A few minutes later, they skim over Beloy Mountain, today's Mount St. Hilaire, and come within 10 feet of striking the big cross that the Bishop of Quebec had planted there a few years earlier during a temperance picnic. Joe yells, "To the right, Baptiste, steer to the right, or else you will send us all to Le Diable if you keep on going that way." Baptiste steers instinctively to the right, straight for Mount Royal, which the men can perceive in the distance by the lights of the city. While passing over Montreal, Baptiste utters a yell and with a flourish of his paddle over his head, sends the canoe plunging into a snowdrift into a clearing on the side of the mountain. Luckily, the snow is soft, nobody is injured, and the canoe is still intact. However, Baptiste, in a drunken stupor, declares that he is going to go downtown to have another drink. The lumberjacks try reasoning with him to no avail. After a brief consultation, they jump Baptiste, hold him down in the snow, and bind him hand and foot to ensure he cannot escape. They place him back into the canoe and even gag him to prevent any cursing. With a rousing "Acabras, acabras, acabrum," the canoe shoots into the sky again, this time with Joe steering straight for the Gatineau. As the clock ticks, the men worry that it may be too late to save their souls. They follow the Ottawa River as far as the Point Gatineau and then steer due north using the Polar Star to navigate towards the lumber camp. All of a sudden, Baptiste manages to free himself from the ropes and pull off the gag. He stands up, paddle in hand, and begins swearing like a pagan. With only a few miles to go, the men paddle furiously through the air over a pine forest. Baptiste begins swinging his paddle wildly in the air as he curses. Taken aback, Joe makes a false movement with his paddle, causing the canoe to lurch downwards towards the forest. They slam into a large pine tree, and then men begin falling through the branches towards the snowy ground below. Joe is knocked unconscious during the fall. When he wakes up at around 8 o'clock the next morning, Joe is in his bunk in his cabin. Apparently, his comrades had found the lumberjacks up to their necks in a snowbank at the foot of a gigantic pine tree and brought them back to camp. Having escaped the devil, Joe concludes the tale with, "All I can say, my friends, is that it is not so amusing as some might think to travel in mid-air in the dead of winter under the guidance of Beelzebub running La Chasse-Galerie, especially if you have a drunkard to steer your bark canoe. Take my advice and don't listen to anyone who would try to rope you in for such a trip. Wait until summer before you go to see your sweethearts, for it is better to run all the rapids of the Ottawa and the St. Lawrence on a raft than to travel in partnership with Le Diable himself. While Beaugrand's version of the story saves the men from an eternity in hell, many other versions are not as generous to the woodsman. During the climax of S.E. Schlosser's tale, for example, the men screamed, clutching to the sides of the craft as if this would help break the fall. Then the canoe smashed into the top of a large pine tree, and the men tumbled out and fell down towards a gaping dark hole that snapped open in the earth beneath them. It looked like the open jaws of a shark waiting to swallow them whole. In its depths, the lumberjacks could see the raging red fires of hell. Baptiste and the other men plunged into the hole, and it snapped shut behind them with a sharp cracking sound that echoed through the forest. In the treetop, the broken black canoe pulsed again with a blinding red light and then disappeared in a puff of sulphurous smoke. In some versions of the tale, the men are never seen again, whereas in others, they are doomed to hurtle through the air in the canoe en route to hell every New Year's Eve. There can be no denying that the legend of Chasse-Galerie has inspired many artistic creations, including paintings, plays, animations, films, songs, and symphonies. The tale has even inspired restaurants and a craft beer. In La Valtrie, the Café Culturel de la Chasse-Galerie features a fine menu along with live entertainment and cultural events. For beer lovers, a microbrewery called Unibrew was so inspired by the story that its brewmasters created a strong craft beer called Maudite, translation, The Damned, in 1992. With a content of 8% alcohol, the label features the canoe flying past Montreal with the devil grinning in the background. In the arts, the tale has inspired many prestigious artists to create works based on it. For example, famous Quebec illustrator and painter Holly Rhiannon created an oil painting on canvas in 1906 called Chasse-Galerie. The fantastic legend has also appeared in theatrical form in the province of Ontario. Toronto's Soul Pepper Theatre produced a version of Chasse-Galerie in 2016, prompting one critic to declare in a review that it deserves to be a new theatre holiday classic. Chasse-Galerie has also been made into various films. In 1996, Robert Doucette created a short animation for the National Film Board. More recently, in 2016, a feature-length movie called Chasse-Galerie, La Légende was launched in French. Directed by Jean-Philippe Duval and starring Francis Ducharme, Caroline Davernat, François Papineau, and Vincent Guillaume Otis, it also features Montreal in several scenes. In music, the legend appears in a spectrum ranging from folk songs to symphony orchestras. One song, called Martin de la Chasse-Galerie by Michel Rivard, also situates the flying canoe over Montreal. In the lyrics, young women frequenting Saint-Denis are implored to look up if they hear a noise in the sky to witness the damned canoe flying past. Not to be outdone, the Montreal Symphony Orchestra produced Le Diable en canoe de course, un conte de Noël de Michel Tremblay in December 2017. The audience was treated to the storytelling skills of popular actor Laurent Paquin as Maestro Kent Nagano conducted the orchestra throughout the tale. Written by Montreal's most famous playwright, Michel Tremblay, the performance took place beneath a suspended birch bark canoe with wings made from wooden paddles. Furthermore, in Tremblay's version, Montreal stars as the location of the party that the lumberjacks visit. With so many versions of the legend crossing so many artistic mediums, Chasse-Galerie is certainly the most popular folk story in both Montreal and Quebec. Rooted in the era of New France, this cautionary tale continues to inspire people to this very day and will likely continue to do so long into the future. For those celebrating New Year's Eve in Montreal, the legend has it that if a person hears a noise from the sky, they should look upwards. The odds are that they might just witness a flying canoe full of screaming, terrified lumberjacks whipping past them on their perilous journey to hell. Are you a Montreal resident or perhaps a tourist who has had a paranormal experience in this city? If so, we'd love to know. As always, we want to hear your theories about what could be going on. Thank you so much for stopping by. If it's your first video, we do hope you'll stick around for the next one. We normally post videos in both French and English every Saturday, but we'll not be doing so through the month of December. We'll see you back in 2023, bright and early on January 7th. Please remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Have a wonderful holiday season and stay spooky.